really wanted to make a commercial when I discovered that I was that sick and my time was so limited. I wanted to make that commercial that says simply, now that I'm gone, I tell you, don't smoke.
Hollywood has always thrived on drama, but sometimes the fiercest battles never make it to the screen. They happen behind the cameras. Few rivalries were as notorious as the feud between Yul Brynner, the regal star of The King and I, and Steve McQueen, the rising rebel who embodied cool. Their clash began during the filming of The Magnificent Seven, a project meant to unite talent, but instead ignited one of Hollywood's bitterest hatreds. What began as subtle gestures spiraled into an all-out war of egos, jealousy, and sabotage. But why did Brynner hate McQueen so much? Stay with us. When Yul Brynner first encountered Steve McQueen on the set of The Magnificent Seven in 1960, the tension was almost immediate. Brynner was already an established star, adored worldwide for his commanding presence, his bald head, and his ability to dominate any stage or screen. McQueen, however, was the hungry newcomer, a television actor with a chip on his shoulder and a burning need to prove himself. The set was supposed to be Brynner's kingdom, but McQueen had no intention of playing a supporting role, even if the script said otherwise. From day one, subtle frictions began to bubble. McQueen, never content to stay in the background, employed tricks to draw attention during filming, fiddling with his hat, loading his gun, or kicking dirt at just the right moment to steal the audience's gaze. Brynner, a consummate perfectionist, noticed every single gesture. What might have seemed harmless improvisation to others was, to him, blatant disrespect. He saw McQueen not just as a co-star, but as a direct threat to his authority, his reputation, and his screen dominance. Behind closed doors, Brynner began voicing his frustrations to crew members. He felt undermined, humiliated even, that a younger, less experienced actor dared to challenge him in such a way. Meanwhile, McQueen, far from apologizing, reveled in the tension. To him, Brynner's outrage only confirmed that his scene-stealing tactics were working. The clash of personalities, Brynner's regal pride versus McQueen's rebellious hunger, set the tone for what would become a toxic, unrelenting feud. For Brynner, this wasn't just a disagreement, it was a declaration of war. And as filming continued, his dislike hardened into something far deeper, an utter hatred that would haunt both men for the rest of their lives. The Magnificent Seven was meant to be a career-defining project for Yul Brynner. Already riding high from The King and I and the Ten Commandments, Brynner was not only the film's lead, but also one of its driving forces behind the scenes. He envisioned himself as the centerpiece, the commanding leader of a group of rugged gunslingers. But fate and Steve McQueen's relentless ambition had other plans. From the very beginning of production, Brynner's dominance was challenged. McQueen, though less experienced on the big screen, brought a natural charisma that the camera loved. He didn't need dialogue to capture attention. Every tilt of his head, every twitch of his hand carried weight. In ensemble scenes, audiences' eyes often drifted toward him, a fact that drove Brynner into silent rage. What made matters worse was Brynner's towering ego. He expected reverence on set, a level of respect fitting his star status. But McQueen wasn't the type to bow to authority. Instead, he treated Brynner as an equal, or worse, as someone to outshine. To Brynner, this was insubordination of the highest order. He had carefully constructed the film to be his showcase, but McQueen's antics turned it into a duel for attention. Crew members quickly noticed the tension. Some recalled the unspoken hostility in group scenes, with Brynner glaring at McQueen's subtle scene-stealing tricks. Others admitted that the rivalry actually heightened the film's energy, giving the finished product a raw authenticity. But for Brynner, there was no silver lining. Every frame with McQueen felt like a battle he was losing. What should have been a magnificent partnership instead became a powder keg. By the time filming wrapped, the seeds of hatred had fully taken root. Brinner no longer saw McQueen as a colleague. He saw him as an enemy who had trespassed on his territory. And for Yul Brynner, that was unforgivable. If there was one thing Steve McQueen mastered on the set of The Magnificent Seven, it was the art of scene stealing. McQueen knew the power of subtlety, and he wielded it like a weapon against Yul Brynner. Whenever Brynner was speaking, delivering lines with his trademark authority, McQueen would be in the background, deliberately drawing the viewer's eye. He'd tip his cowboy hat just so, fiddle with his rifle, or pour out bullets and reload them one by one. These weren't random actions, they were calculated distractions. McQueen understood that in the silent language of film, even the smallest movement could command attention, and audiences, consciously or not, couldn't help but look at him. For Brynner, this was nothing short of sabotage. He had built his career on dominating the screen, using his regal presence to overwhelm co-stars. But McQueen's tricks neutralized that advantage. Suddenly, the mighty Yul Brynner wasn't the only magnetic presence in the frame. He was being overshadowed, sometimes without McQueen even uttering a word. Behind the scenes, Brynner seethed. He accused McQueen of unprofessionalism, of undermining the film's focus. To Brynner, these antics weren't playful. They were deliberate acts of war. He believed McQueen was mocking him, exploiting every opportunity to chip away at his authority. McQueen, however, relished the conflict. To him, this was Hollywood survival. He was determined not to be a mere background player in Brynner's grand production. Every hat tip, every flick of his revolver was both rebellion and declaration. Steve McQueen was here, and he would not be ignored. The result was a cold war of gestures, played out in front of rolling cameras. And though Brynner maintained the official lead role, McQueen's bold scene stealing would ensure he walked away with something even more valuable: legendary status, earned at Brynner's expense. Yul Brynner was not a man accustomed to sharing the spotlight. For years, his commanding presence and distinctive look made him the unquestioned centerpiece of any production. On the stage in The King and I, or on the epic sets of The Ten Commandments, his dominance was absolute. But on the dusty sets of The Magnificent Seven, he found himself battling for attention. Not with the script, not with the director, but with a co-star who refused to stay in the background. Steve McQueen's antics infuriated him. At first, Brynner tried to assert control. He spoke to the director, John Sturges, complaining that McQueen's constant fidgeting and business on camera were distracting from the story. But Sturges, charmed by McQueen's natural magnetism, largely ignored Brynner's protests. This only deepened the humiliation. Brynner, the established star, felt powerless, sidelined by a younger actor who seemed to thrive on his frustration. The situation worsened during ensemble scenes. Brynner would deliver key lines, expecting the camera and the audience to hang on his every word. Yet when the footage was reviewed, it became clear that many eyes would drift toward McQueen, who was always in motion, always giving viewers something to notice. For Brynner, it was intolerable. Crew members recalled Brynner's growing paranoia. He would reportedly pace between takes, muttering about McQueen's childish tricks. At one point, he even tried to impose rules on set, demanding that no one else move or fidget while he was speaking. To the crew, it came across as desperation. To McQueen, it was proof that he had gotten under Brynner's skin. What began as irritation hardened into open hostility. Brynner wasn't just annoyed, he felt robbed. His film, his role, his authority were being challenged in a way he couldn't control. And for a man who thrived on absolute dominance, that was unforgivable. Of all the battles between Yul Brynner and Steve McQueen, none was more infamous, or more bizarre, than the so-called Hat War. It started with something seemingly trivial: cowboy hats. On a Western set, hats were more than costumes. They were symbols of power, personality, and hierarchy. Brenner, ever conscious of his commanding image, chose a tall, broad-brimmed hat designed to emphasize his stature and authority. He wanted to look bigger than life. McQueen, however, saw an opportunity. Knowing Brenner's obsession with control, he deliberately selected hats that made his co-star look smaller by comparison. If Brenner wore a tall crown, McQueen picked one lower, which subtly drew the audience's eye to his face. If Brenner's brim was wide, McQueen's was narrower, adding to his sleek, rebellious aura. The difference was subtle on camera, but devastating to Brenner's ego. The feud escalated when Brenner reportedly demanded that no one else wear hats that might rival his own. He wanted dominance, not competition. McQueen, predictably, ignored him. Instead, he leaned into the rivalry, joking with crew members and making small adjustments to ensure he always looked effortlessly cooler than the self-serious Brenner. For Brenner, this was humiliation. He saw McQueen's choices as deliberate sabotage, an attack on his carefully cultivated image as the film's leader. To lose attention to a younger actor because of something as simple as a hat felt insulting, intolerable, and deeply personal. The hat war became legendary among the cast and crew, a symbol of just how petty and bitter the feud had become. To outsiders, it might have seemed comical, but for Brenner, it was proof that McQueen was undermining him at every turn, reducing his authority piece by piece, and each slight, however small, deepened his hatred. Life on the set of The Magnificent Seven quickly became a battlefield, not just for Yul Brynner and Steve McQueen, but for everyone around them. The crew, caught in the middle, were forced to tiptoe around two stars whose egos clashed daily. What should have been a smooth production turned into a powder keg of tension, with every gesture and decision scrutinized for signs of disrespect. Camera operators had one of the hardest jobs. Brynner frequently demanded shots that emphasized his authority, insisting the camera linger on him longer or be angled to make him appear taller. McQueen, meanwhile, used every trick to grab the lens's attention, adding small movements, shifting his posture, or fidgeting with props. The result? Endless arguments about framing, blocking, and who truly commanded the screen. Crew members later recalled the exhaustion of navigating this rivalry. Brynner's commands carried weight, but McQueen's charisma made it hard to rein him in. Lighting technicians, costume designers, even sound operators were pulled into the feud, each pressured to subtly favor one star over the other. Neutrality was nearly impossible. Tensions also spread among the other actors. Some sympathized with Brynner, viewing McQueen's antics as arrogant disrespect. Others admired McQueen's daring, seeing him as a rising star who refused to be overshadowed. Loyalties divided the cast, adding yet another layer of strain to an already fraught production. The atmosphere became so toxic that even John Sturges, the director, reportedly struggled to maintain control. He once remarked that filming the action sequences was easier than managing the two leads' egos. The crew often joked that the real showdown wasn't between gunfighters on screen, it was the silent war raging between Brynner and McQueen behind the camera. By the end of production, morale was strained, patience was thin, and everyone knew one thing for certain. The feud had grown bigger than the movie itself. When filming wrapped on The Magnificent Seven, most of the cast hoped the feud between Yul Brynner and Steve McQueen would fade. Instead, it spilled into the press, where interviews became weapons in their ongoing war of egos. Both men, too proud to name the other directly, used sly remarks and barbed comments to stake their claims on who truly owned the film. Brynner, already an Oscar-winning star thanks to The King and I, leaned into his established reputation. In interviews, he portrayed himself as the steady leader on set, implying that younger actors, namely McQueen, had been distracting and unprofessional. He never dropped McQueen's name, but the undertone was clear. There had been a rogue element undermining his authority. McQueen, on the other hand, was careful and calculating. In conversations with journalists, he painted himself as the underdog, hungry, inventive, and unafraid to stand toe-to-toe with Hollywood royalty. Without openly criticizing Brenner, he hinted that the production's greatest tension came from someone unwilling to share the stage. These thinly veiled jabs were designed to cast Brenner as a jealous tyrant and McQueen as the rebellious new face of cinema. The media, of course, seized on the drama. Reporters loved the narrative of a reigning king clashing with a rising challenger. Headlines exaggerated the feud, framing it as a Hollywood power struggle that mirrored the duel between their on-screen characters. Each time Brenner or McQueen spoke, it poured more fuel on the fire, ensuring the story stayed alive long after filming ended. Behind the scenes, publicists tried to downplay the rivalry, but the damage was done. Fans, critics, and even industry insiders began taking sides. For Brenner, the press battle was humiliating, his dignity questioned, his dominance challenged. For McQueen, it was the perfect springboard to superstardom. By turning interviews into subtle battlegrounds, McQueen proved he wasn't just competing on screen, he was winning the war for Hollywood's spotlight. While the feud between Yul Brynner and Steve McQueen played out publicly, the real story was far darker and far more personal behind closed doors. Brynner, known for his magnetic charm and commanding presence, harbored a seething resentment that he never fully revealed on camera. Friends, colleagues, and even some crew members later admitted that his polite smiles and professional demeanor masked a deep, simmering grudge. According to accounts, Brynner privately complained about McQueen incessantly. He would vent to trusted assistants and close friends about how McQueen had stolen attention, mocked his authority, and undermined the film. The star reportedly spent hours dissecting every scene, analyzing camera angles and replaying footage to see exactly how McQueen had shifted the spotlight. For Brynner, it wasn't just a professional slight, it was a personal affront. He also reportedly questioned McQueen's character, seeing his co-star as opportunistic and reckless. While McQueen's on-set behavior might have seemed harmless or clever to outsiders, Brynner interpreted it as deliberate sabotage. Each playful movement, each scene-stealing gesture, fueled a growing sense of betrayal. To Brynner, the younger actor was not simply ambitious, he was threatening Brynner's legacy. This private grudge intensified over the years. Even after filming ended, Brynner continued to reference McQueen in letters and interviews, often in veiled terms that suggested ongoing contempt. Close friends noted that he would bring up the feud in casual conversation, reliving the same slights and humiliations with fresh indignation each time. Ultimately, the tension between Brynner and McQueen was more than Hollywood rivalry. It was a clash of egos, pride, and personal insecurities. Behind the charm, Brynner nursed a deep-seated grudge that no public appearance could mask, a grudge that would define his relationship with McQueen for the rest of their lives. The feud between Yul Brynner and Steve McQueen didn't end when The Magnificent Seven wrapped. It lingered, festering for years, haunting both men's careers. While Hollywood moved on, Brynner and McQueen carried a private grudge that refused to fade, a silent war marked by avoidance, subtle jabs, and unspoken hostility whenever their paths crossed. Brynner's resentment was especially enduring. He reportedly monitored McQueen's rising fame with jealousy, irritated that the younger actor's popularity sometimes rivaled or eclipsed his own. Interviews, magazine spreads, and public appearances were constantly filtered through his perception of McQueen as a threat, a man who had dared to challenge his authority and steal the limelight. Even years later, Brynner's friends recalled him bringing up McQueen with a mixture of bitterness and disbelief, as if the offense had occurred yesterday rather than decades prior. McQueen, however, seemed largely unbothered by Brynner's lingering animosity. To him, the feud was a challenge he had long since won. His career skyrocketed after The Magnificent Seven, and he became the very embodiment of cool, an icon of rebellion and charisma. Yet he was never oblivious to Brinner's private anger, aware that the elder star still held grudges that could surface in social or professional settings. The tension occasionally erupted in public settings, subtle enough to avoid scandal, but visible to those paying attention. A curt glance, a polite but clipped response, even shared events carried the weight of decades of resentment. Colleagues learned to navigate these interactions carefully, understanding that the feud was personal, not performative. Ultimately, the prolonged animosity between Brinner and McQueen became a defining feature of their post-Magnificent Seven careers. What began as a professional clash over the spotlight evolved into a personal vendetta that neither man could fully escape, a lingering shadow over two of Hollywood's most iconic figures. The feud between Yul Brynner and Steve McQueen has outlasted the actors themselves, cementing its place in Hollywood lore. Industry insiders, biographers, and film historians frequently cite their clash as one of the most intense rivalries of the studio era, an epic battle of egos that shaped perceptions of both stars long after the cameras stopped rolling. Brynner, with his commanding presence and regal authority, was remembered not only for his talent, but also for his deep-seated resentment toward McQueen. Stories of his private complaints, strict demands on set, and lingering bitterness colored his legacy, showing that beneath the charm and confidence lay a man fiercely protective of his status. For many, Brynner became a cautionary example of how pride and obsession with control can mar even the most celebrated careers. McQueen, by contrast, emerged from the feud largely unscathed in public opinion. His natural charisma and rebellious style had won over audiences and critics alike, and his fame skyrocketed in the decades that followed. Yet behind the smiles and Hollywood cool, he remained acutely aware of Brynner's animosity, a shadow that lingered in social events, interviews, and film reunions. Their rivalry became almost mythic, a reminder that fame rarely equates to harmony. Hollywood remembered not only the films, but the feud itself. Retrospectives, documentaries, and biographies frequently highlight the tension on the set of The Magnificent Seven, framing it as a dramatic subplot to the movie's production. Fans fascinated by celebrity conflict regard it as an iconic story of pride, ambition, and personal vendettas, one that humanizes two legendary actors. In the end, the Brynner-McQueen rivalry serves as a study in duality. Talent and charisma collided with ego and obsession, leaving a legacy that is part cinematic history, part cautionary tale. It reminds the world that in Hollywood, as in life, brilliance and bitterness often coexist, and that the battles behind the scenes can be just as compelling as the ones on screen. The feud between Yul Brynner and Steve McQueen transformed The Magnificent Seven into more than a film. It became a battlefield of egos, rivalry, and unrelenting resentment. Their clash reminds us that even legends are human, and that behind the glamour, personal grudges can leave a mark on Hollywood history.